Amen, please. Faster, harder." The rancher was terrified, and then he collapsed in exhaustion. The sun had just started to rise over the vast expanse of the ranch, casting a warm, golden glow over the rolling hills. Birds chirped softly, and a gentle breeze rustled the tall grass. John the rancher was already awake, moving with the kind of determination that only comes from years of hard work. His hands, rough and calloused, told the story of decades spent tending cattle, fixing fences, and walking the long stretches of his land before dawn. Today, though, there was a tension in the air that even the morning calm couldn't hide. John had always been a man who respected the land, who understood its moods and rhythms, but something felt off. The sky had a strange, heavy shade to it, as though the clouds themselves were warning him of something to come. He ignored it at first, chalking it up to his imagination. After all, ranching was about patience and endurance, and he knew that worrying over minor things never helped. Yet, as he stepped out of the farmhouse and onto the soft dirt path leading to the barn, a shiver ran down his spine. The ranch was enormous, stretching for miles, dotted with grazing cattle and winding streams that sparkled under the morning light. John's heart had always been tied to this land. Every fence he repaired, every animal he tended to, every small corner of the ranch carried a piece of him. It was more than a job. It was a life built from sweat, dedication, and countless early mornings just like this one. As he walked toward the barn, he noticed that the cattle seemed restless. They moved in uneasy patterns, snorting and pawing at the ground. This wasn't unusual after a storm or when predators were nearby, but the sense of unease today felt different. It gnawed at the back of his mind. John's instincts were sharp from years of living off the land, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. He reached the barn, the familiar scent of hay and animals welcoming him. The cows mooed softly, some peering out at him with their large, trusting eyes. He patted the nearest one, a sturdy brown cow named Bella, and whispered a calming word. Animals, he often thought, could sense danger before humans did. Today, their behavior confirmed his own unease. John spent the next hour checking the fences, making sure every gate was secure and every post stood firm. The wind had begun to pick up, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. He frowned. Smoke wasn't unusual in the distance on the ranch, especially during the dry season, but there was something different about this scent. It was sharper, closer, and it made his stomach tighten with worry. By mid-morning, the ranch was alive with the usual sounds: the lowing of cattle, the creak of wood as gates swayed, and the faint buzz of insects in the fields. But over that peaceful soundtrack, the smell of smoke grew stronger, sharper. John's pace quickened. He ran from fence to fence, checking every corner of the property. Somewhere, he thought, there was a fire. He had to find it before it spread. The ranch wasn't small, and the fields stretched far beyond what a single person could easily manage. John climbed onto his old, reliable tractor, its engine coughing to life, and drove toward the area where the smoke was thickest. The sun was now high in the sky, and the heat pressed down on him, making his shirt stick to his back. The smoke grew denser as he neared the edge of the property, twisting and curling in strange, almost alive shapes. It licked at the edges of the trees and made the air harsh and difficult to breathe. John parked the tractor at a safe distance and stepped out, scanning the area. Flames were small but rapidly growing, licking hungrily at the dry grass and underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with a focused urgency. He knew he had to act quickly. Fire could move faster than any person or animal if left unchecked, and his entire livelihood was at stake. He grabbed the tools he had always kept for emergencies: buckets, shovels, and a fire extinguisher. The fire was small enough that, With careful effort, he could contain it before it got out of control. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he moved toward the flames. Every breath was thick with smoke, and his eyes stung. But John refused to back down. He had faced many challenges in his life, from harsh winters to storms that threatened to wash away his crops, but nothing compared to the unpredictability of fire. The hours passed like a blur. John worked tirelessly, dousing flames with water, smothering patches with dirt, and running back and forth across the field. The sun climbed higher, beating down relentlessly. His muscles ached, and his lungs burned. But still, he pushed forward. Every time he thought he had the fire under control, a sudden gust of wind would send sparks flying, igniting another patch of dry grass. The work was grueling, exhausting, and dangerous, but John's determination never wavered. As the afternoon approached, the fire had spread further than he had anticipated. The smoke was thick, filling his lungs with every breath, making it hard to see. His eyes watered and his skin prickled with heat. He felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on him like a heavy blanket. Still, he refused to give in. For years he had relied on his strength, his knowledge of the land, and his unwavering perseverance to survive the hardships of ranch life. Today was no different. The cattle, sensing the danger, had started to move towards safer areas. John made sure to guide them, waving his arms and calling out to them, urging them to move quickly. Their frightened eyes mirrored his own fear, but he stayed calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. He worked with precision, every movement calculated despite the growing fatigue that weighed down his body. By late afternoon, the fire was finally under control, though small embers still smoldered in the fields. John collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, and completely exhausted. His hands were blistered, his clothes torn, and his body ached from the relentless labor. For a moment, he simply lay there, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the faint lowing of the cattle in the distance. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day began to fade, leaving only the raw, heavy exhaustion that comes from giving everything one has. As he caught his breath, he realized how close he had come to disaster. The fire had been fierce and unpredictable, and the consequences of failure would have been devastating. But he had faced it head-on, relying on his instincts, experience, and sheer willpower. The relief that washed over him was immense, but so was the toll it had taken. John slowly stood, brushing the dirt from his clothes and checking the perimeter one last time. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields. The sky glowed with the remnants of the day's battle, orange and red hues blending with the smoke that still lingered in the air. He felt a mix of pride and exhaustion, knowing that he had survived the challenge, but also that his body had paid a heavy price. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, his steps heavy but steady, he thought about the day's events. Ranch life was never easy, and it demanded everything from those who chose it. But it also gave back in ways nothing else could. The satisfaction of hard work, the beauty of the land, and the resilience that comes from facing challenges head-on. John knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more responsibilities, and perhaps more dangers, but he also knew that he was ready to face them. Finally, reaching the safety of his home, he sank into a chair on the porch, staring out over the fields he had fought so hard to protect. The smoke had cleared, the cattle were safe, and for now, the ranch was secure. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over him, and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not for the easy days, but for the strength to survive the hard ones. The night fell quietly over the ranch, the stars twinkling faintly above the vast fields. The air was cooler now, carrying the soft scent of the earth after the day's chaos. John sat on the porch of his farmhouse, his body still aching from the relentless effort earlier. Every muscle felt sore, every joint protested with each movement, but he refused to dwell on the discomfort. Instead, he let his mind wander over the events of the day, replaying the fire's sudden flare-ups and the relentless effort it had taken to keep it from spreading. Even as the exhaustion pressed heavily upon him, there was little time to rest. Ranch life was rarely forgiving. He knew the next day would demand more of him, not just from the lingering danger of fire, but from the many other responsibilities that came with running such a vast property. He thought of the fences that had been weakened by the smoke and heat, the water troughs that needed refilling, and the areas of the pasture that had been scorched. The work was endless, yet it was a labor he accepted willingly. The night air grew colder, and John finally went inside to check on the cattle once more. In the dim light of the barn, he moved carefully among them. The animals were calmer than earlier, but he could still sense a faint unease. They had survived the scare, yes, but animals remembered danger, and John knew that their wariness would linger. He murmured gentle words, offering them reassurance with soft pats and quiet tones. He had learned that calmness and consistency were just as important as physical protection when it came to animals. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, John felt the full weight of the day. His hands were cracked and sore, his face smudged with ash, and his clothes damp with sweat. He poured himself a glass of water and sat in the quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. He reflected on the fire and realized that it had revealed something about him. His resilience, yes, but also his limits. He had pushed himself further than he ever had, and while he had won the battle for the ranch, he had done so at a cost to his body. Sleep did not come easily that night. John tossed and turned, haunted by memories of the smoke and flames, of the fear that had tightened his chest earlier. Even as his body begged for rest, his mind refused to settle. He reviewed every detail of the day, wondering if he had missed anything, if the fire could return, or if other dangers might be lurking on the land. Ranch life demanded vigilance, and John knew that the smallest oversight could lead to disaster. By early morning he rose again, the sky still painted with the soft pink and orange hues of dawn. His body protested, but he moved methodically, following a routine that had been ingrained in him over decades. First, he checked the water supply, making sure the troughs were full and clean. The fire had not reached the creek, thankfully, but he knew that dry conditions could change that at any moment. Water was life, both for the animals and for the land itself, and John never took it for granted. Next, he inspected the areas of the ranch that had been affected by the fire. The grass was scorched in places, and the earth smelled faintly of smoke. Some of the smaller trees had been singed, their leaves curled and brown at the edges. John walked slowly among them, noting which areas would need attention in the coming days. He thought about the seeds he would plant, the saplings he would nurture, and the time it would take for the land to fully recover. It was a process, he reminded himself, one that required patience, persistence, and care. By mid-morning, John had returned to his barn. The sun was now high, beating down on the fields with a heat that reminded him of the fire from the previous day. Sweat quickly dampened his shirt as he worked to repair fences damaged by the heat and wind. Each hammer strike and each knot tied in the wire felt heavier than usual. His muscles ached with the lingering fatigue, yet he refused to slow down. The ranch demanded attention, and he was determined to give it. The cattle had begun to stir, grazing cautiously in the areas still unaffected by the fire. John moved among them, checking their health, and ensuring none showed signs of stress. Animals, like humans, could be affected by trauma, and he knew that the previous day's ordeal might have left them unsettled. He offered them reassurance, speaking softly and maintaining a steady presence. Gradually, they seemed to relax, returning to their familiar rhythms of eating and wandering. By late morning, John paused for a brief rest. He leaned against the side of the barn, taking deep breaths of the fresh air. Despite the pain in his body and the exhaustion in his limbs, he felt a quiet pride. He had faced a significant challenge and had emerged victorious. But ranch life had a way of reminding him that victory was only temporary. Nature, unpredictable and relentless, would always test him again. As he prepared to continue his work, John noticed dark clouds forming on the horizon. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a scent of rain and earth. While the change in weather was welcome, it also brought a sense of urgency. If the skies opened and the rain came in torrents, the weakened areas of the land could suffer damage, and the animals might become restless or unsafe. He needed to secure the property before the storm arrived. John worked with methodical determination, checking each section of the ranch, reinforcing fences, and moving supplies to higher ground. His hands were raw from the previous day, and each movement reminded him of his own vulnerability. Yet, he continued, knowing that preparedness was the only way to protect the land he loved. Time passed quickly, the clouds moving faster now, darker and more threatening. The first drops of rain fell, lightly at first, then heavier, pounding the earth in a rhythmic drumbeat. The cattle reacted quickly, moving toward sheltered areas as John guided them with careful commands. He worked tirelessly, moving between animals and fences, ensuring that everything was secure. The rain was relentless now, soaking him to the bone and making the ground slick and slippery. He could feel exhaustion building again, heavier this time, pressing down with the weight of the previous day's labor and the intensity of the current storm. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of slowing. Lightning split the sky in brilliant, jagged lines, followed by thunder that rumbled through the fields. John's heart pounded with both the thrill and fear of the storm. He had faced fire, but water brought its own challenges. Flooded areas could trap animals, weaken fences, and erode the land. He had to remain vigilant, despite the fatigue and the pounding rain. By late afternoon, the storm finally began to ease, leaving the ranch drenched but intact. John sank to the ground near the barn, completely exhausted. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his muscles quivering from the unrelenting labor. Yet, as he looked around, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The cattle were safe, the land had survived another trial, and he had pushed himself beyond what he thought possible. As he slowly stood and made his way to the farmhouse, John realized that the day had taught him more about endurance, patience, and the unpredictability of life than any other experience in recent memory. Ranch life was a constant test of resilience, and he knew that challenges would come again in new and unexpected forms. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new tasks, new decisions, and new responsibilities. Finally, reaching the porch, he sat down and watched the rain-drenched fields glisten in the fading light. The sky was clearing, revealing a few stars amidst the clouds. The air smelled fresh, alive with the scent of wet earth and grass. John closed his eyes, allowing the exhaustion to wash over him, and whispered a quiet word of thanks, not for the ease of the day, but for the strength to face its trials and survive. The next morning, the ranch was quiet, almost eerily so. The previous day's fire and storm had left the land transformed. The grass was flattened in some places, scorched in others, and the paths John usually walked were slick with mud. The sun rose slowly, casting a soft golden light that seemed to bring a fragile calm to the ranch. John stepped outside, his body still heavy from 2 days of relentless labor, and took a deep breath of the fresh, rain-washed air. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel relief, a fleeting pause in the constant rhythm of ranch life. But peace rarely lasted long on a ranch, and John knew it. He had spent decades learning that nature could change in an instant, that calm mornings could quickly turn into emergencies. The fire and the storm had been reminders of this truth, and though the land had survived, it would need careful attention to recover fully. He began his day with a thorough inspection, walking slowly across the fields, checking the fences, the water sources, and the animals. His eyes scanned for damage that the rain or wind might have hidden, and his mind was alert for any signs of danger. The cattle were grazing quietly, but John noticed that some of the younger calves were restless. Their movements were uneven, and their heads were lowered as if they sensed something he could not yet see. He moved among them, speaking softly and placing a steady hand on their backs. Animals could be unsettled by sudden changes, and the combination of fire, smoke, and heavy rain had certainly left its mark. John's calm presence was enough to soothe them, though he knew that in the coming days he would need to keep a careful eye on their health and behavior. By mid-morning, John turned his attention to the creek that ran along the edge of the property. The rain had swelled the water, turning it into a fast-moving stream. Some of the smaller banks had been eroded, and the soil was soft and treacherous. He needed to reinforce the banks before the water undermined the fences or created dangerous areas for the animals. John rolled up his sleeves, feeling the cool water on his hands as he began to move rocks and soil into place, carefully shaping the land to guide the flow of water safely. The work was exhausting, but necessary. Every decision mattered. As he labored, John's mind wandered to the upcoming season. Winter would arrive sooner than he liked, bringing harsher weather, frozen streams, and more challenges for the animals. He would need to ensure the cattle had enough feed, that the shelters were secure, and that the land was prepared to withstand the cold months ahead. The thought weighed on him, but he welcomed it. Planning, preparation, and hard work were the tools he relied on to survive and thrive on the ranch. The hours passed quickly, and John could feel the strain in his muscles growing stronger. Sweat mixed with the mud on his skin, leaving a sheen that reflected the sun's rays. Yet, even as his body cried out for rest, he pushed forward, knowing that the safety and well-being of his animals depended on his efforts. He carefully inspected each fence along the creek, adjusting posts and reinforcing wire where needed. The young calves followed him cautiously, sensing his focus and determination. By early afternoon, John decided to take a short break. He leaned against a fence post, wiping mud from his brow and drinking from his water bottle. The ranch stretched out before him, fields glistening under the sun, streams winding through the landscape, and the cattle moving cautiously but steadily in their pastures. Despite the challenges, John felt a deep connection to this land. Every struggle, every moment of exhaustion was part of a life he had chosen and cherished. As he resumed work, a sudden noise drew his attention. From the far edge of the property, a loud crash echoed through the fields. John froze, his heart pounding. The sound was unfamiliar, sharp, and alarming. Instinctively, he scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the bright sun. Then he saw it. A large tree, weakened by the storm, had toppled, its massive trunk sprawled across a section of the fence. The impact had left a gaping hole, and some of the cattle had wandered dangerously close to the creek. John's pulse quickened. The danger was immediate. He sprinted toward the fallen tree, moving with speed born of urgency, rather than strength. The mud made the ground slippery, and his boots slipped more than once, but he pressed forward. He reached the site, panting heavily, and assessed the situation. The tree was too large to move quickly by himself, but the cattle could not remain near the water. He needed a plan, and fast. Thinking quickly, John grabbed ropes and guided the cattle away from the creek, urging them calmly but firmly. Their ears flicked nervously, and they hesitated, but his steady voice reassured them. One by one, he moved them to a safer section of the field, far from the treacherous bank. Sweat poured down his face, and his hands were scraped and muddy, but he refused to stop until every animal was secure. Once the cattle were safe, John turned his attention to the fallen tree. It would take hours, maybe the better part of the day, to remove it and repair the fence. He began by cutting smaller branches with a handsaw, clearing debris piece by piece. Each swing of the saw required immense effort, his arms shaking with fatigue. The work was slow and grueling, but progress, however small, was better than despair. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the physical strain began to take its toll. John's breathing was heavy, his shirt soaked through with sweat, and his muscles screamed in protest. Yet he continued, determined to restore the safety of the ranch. Every cut, every lifted branch was a step toward regaining control over the land. He reminded himself that patience and persistence were as important as strength and skill. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the fields. The tree was partially cleared, enough to allow the fence to be temporarily repaired and the cattle to move freely. John leaned against a post, chest heaving, hands trembling from exhaustion. He had faced the immediate danger, but he knew the work was far from over. The ranch demanded continuous attention, and the day's challenges had only reminded him of how unpredictable life on the land could be. As evening approached, John made his way back to the farmhouse. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, the last light of day reflecting off the rain-soaked fields. He paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the landscape he had fought so hard to protect. Despite the exhaustion, the fear, and the relentless challenges, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The ranch was his life, and no matter how difficult the days became, he was determined to face them head-on. Inside the farmhouse, John washed the mud and sweat from his hands and face, feeling the ache in every joint and muscle. Dinner was simple but nourishing, giving him the energy to recover from the day's labors. He sat quietly afterward, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the faint lowing of cattle settling for the night. The storm, the fire, the fallen tree, all reminders of life's unpredictability, had tested him, yet he had endured. Before going to bed, John made a final inspection of the perimeter, walking slowly along the fences, checking that each post was secure and each gate properly closed. The ranch was safe for the night, and the cattle were calm. He returned to the farmhouse, body weary but mind alert, reflecting on the day's events. Life on the ranch was never easy, but it was a life of purpose, responsibility, and connection to the land, to the animals, and to himself. Finally, as the stars twinkled above the quiet fields, John allowed himself to rest. His body sank into the bed, every ache and pain a reminder of the hard work he had done, but also of his resilience. He had faced fire, storm, and fallen trees, yet he had emerged stronger, more determined, and ready to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. The ranch was his life, and he would continue to protect it with all the strength, patience, and courage he possessed. The following morning, the ranch was quiet, almost too quiet. The previous days had left the land battered, scorched patches from the fire, muddy fields from the storm, and fences still recovering from the damage. John stepped outside, stretching his stiff muscles, and surveyed the property. The rising sun cast long shadows across the fields, and a cool breeze swept over the pastures, carrying the fresh scent of wet earth. Despite the calm, there was an unease in the air, a tension that John could not ignore. He began his day as always, moving slowly among the cattle to check their health. The animals were alert, grazing cautiously, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the distant hills. John had learned over the years to read these subtle signs. Animals could sense danger before humans did, and their alertness suggested that something on the ranch was not quite right. He whispered reassuring words and gently patted the heads of the larger cows, trying to soothe their unease. After tending to the cattle, John turned his attention to the fields. Some areas were still soft from the storm, with deep ruts and puddles making movement difficult. The fences that had been temporarily repaired needed more work, and he knew that if another storm or wind came, they could fail again. With determination, he set to work, checking posts, tightening wires, and replacing broken sections. His hands were already raw from the previous days, and every movement reminded him of the lingering exhaustion in his muscles. By mid-morning, John decided to inspect the far edges of the ranch, near the hills that bordered his property. The terrain there was steeper and more rugged, and after the fire it had become more dangerous. Loose soil and weakened trees posed risks, and he wanted to ensure that no cattle had wandered too close. He mounted his old horse, a sturdy animal named Thunder, and set off at a steady pace, feeling the familiar rhythm of riding beneath him. The motion was tiring, but it allowed him to cover more ground efficiently. As he reached the top of a hill, John paused, scanning the landscape. That's when he noticed movement near the tree line. A small herd of deer, startled and moving quickly across the slope. He frowned. Wildlife was normal on the ranch, but the urgency in their movement suggested that something had spooked them. His eyes followed the direction they came from and caught sight of a large cloud of dust rising near a narrow valley. Curiosity mixed with concern as he guided Thunder closer, careful to maintain a safe distance from whatever was causing the disturbance. As he drew nearer, John realized that it was not wildlife causing the dust, but something far more serious. A section of the hillside had begun to give way, a small landslide caused by the combination of the storm's rain and the weakened soil from the fire. Rocks and soil tumbled down the slope, crashing into the fields below. Panic surged through him. If the landslide reached the pastures or the fences, it could injure the cattle, destroy property, and leave the land dangerously unstable. John urged Thunder to move quickly but carefully, navigating the slippery and uneven ground. He needed to act fast to protect the cattle that were grazing in the lower fields. He called out warnings, his voice carrying across the open space. The animals looked up, startled, and began moving toward safer areas as John guided them with a combination of voice and gestures. His body ached from the strain, but he pushed forward, knowing that hesitation could lead to disaster. By mid-afternoon, John had managed to move all the cattle out of the immediate danger zone. His chest heaved with exhaustion, but he could not afford to rest yet. The landslide had destabilized part of the hillside, leaving rocks and loose soil scattered across the fields. He needed to reinforce the area to prevent further collapse, using whatever materials he could find. Rocks, wooden posts, and wire. He began building makeshift barriers. It was painstaking work, each step requiring careful thought and precise effort to avoid further damage. The sun was high, beating down relentlessly, and John's energy began to wane. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the dirt and dust, making every movement sticky and uncomfortable. His muscles burned, his lungs worked harder with each breath, but he refused to stop. The ranch demanded vigilance, and he was determined to meet the challenge head-on. Even as fatigue pressed heavily on him, He relied on experience and instinct to guide each decision. Hours passed in a blur of labor, sweat, and careful attention. Small rocks were shifted, loose soil was packed, and the cattle were moved continually to ensure their safety. Every step was slow and deliberate, as one wrong move could trigger further collapse. John's mind was sharp despite the exhaustion, each decision carefully calculated. He knew that endurance was not just about physical strength, but also about focus, patience, and clarity under pressure. By late afternoon, the immediate danger of the landslide was under control. The hillside was reinforced enough to prevent further soil movement, and the cattle were safe in a secure section of the fields. John sank onto a rock, gasping for air, every muscle trembling from the relentless work. His hands were blistered, his shirt soaked through with sweat, and his body ached with fatigue. But he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had faced yet another natural challenge, and the ranch had survived. As he rested, John surveyed the damage. The storm, the fire, and now the landslide had left visible marks on the land. Scorched patches of grass, muddy fields, and displaced soil reminded him of the constant battle to maintain the ranch. Yet, in the midst of the destruction, he also saw resilience. Trees had withstood the wind, water flowed steadily through the streams, and the cattle were safe and calm. The land, like him, endured through hardship and persisted despite adversity. Evening began to fall, painting the sky with shades of orange, pink, and purple. John stood and began the slow journey back to the farmhouse. His body was heavy, each step a reminder of the labor he had endured. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in his movements, a sense of purpose fulfilled. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, perhaps even greater than those of the past few days, but he also knew that he had the strength, skill, and determination to meet them. Inside the farmhouse, John cleaned up, washing away the dirt, sweat, and dust that had accumulated over the long day. Dinner was simple but nourishing, providing the energy he needed to recover. As he ate, he reflected on the day's events. Life on the ranch was unpredictable, demanding, and often exhausting, but it was also rewarding. The connection to the land, the care of the animals, and the satisfaction of hard work were rewards that no other life could offer. Before going to bed, John made his usual rounds of the property. The stars twinkled above, the air was cool, and the ranch was quiet once more. He checked the fences, the gates, and the animals, ensuring that everything was secure. The landslide had been a severe test, but the ranch had withstood it, and he had guided the animals to safety. His body was tired beyond measure, but his mind was calm, reassured by the knowledge that he had done everything possible to protect the land he loved. Finally, as he climbed into bed, John allowed himself a deep breath of relief. The day had been long, the challenges daunting, and the labor exhausting, yet he had endured. The ranch, his life's work, remained intact, and the cattle were safe. The struggles of fire, storm, and landslide had tested him in ways both physical and mental, but he had faced each trial with courage, skill, and perseverance. With that thought in mind, he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion carry him into a deep, well-earned sleep. The following morning, John woke with a heavy ache in his body, every muscle protesting from the relentless days of labor. Yet, as always, the ranch demanded attention, and there was no time to dwell on pain. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the fields still glistening from the previous day's rain. The smell of wet earth and grass filled the air, and the soft sounds of cattle stirring echoed across the pastures. John rose slowly, stretching, and prepared himself for another long day. He began by walking among the cattle, checking each animal carefully. The younger calves seemed more confident than yesterday, their movement steadier, but some still showed signs of stress from the recent challenges. John murmured calming words and gently touched their heads, allowing them to feel his steady presence. For him, this was as important as repairing fences or clearing fallen trees. The cattle had to trust him, and in turn, he had to understand their needs, their fears, and their limits. By mid-morning, John had turned his attention to the far fields that had been affected by the storm and fire. Patches of scorched grass mixed with muddy sections, making travel and work difficult. He carefully moved through the terrain, inspecting fences, repairing broken posts, and ensuring that the water supply for each section of the ranch was secure. The creek was still swollen in places, and he reinforced the banks with additional rocks and soil, determined to prevent another landslide or flood. Each action required patience and precision, and the work was exhausting, but John knew the safety of his land and animals depended on it. As he worked, he noticed a shadow moving across the horizon. At first, he thought it was another group of deer, or perhaps a cloud passing unusually low, but then he realized it was much larger. A thick bank of dark clouds was rolling in quickly, faster than he had expected. His heart tightened. Rainstorms could be helpful, yes, but when they arrived too suddenly, especially after the weakened soil from previous events, they could be dangerous. He needed to act fast to secure everything before the storm hit. John mounted Thunder and rode swiftly across the ranch, guiding the cattle toward the safer, higher sections of the fields. His hands gripped the reins tightly, mud splattering against his boots as he maneuvered across slippery ground. The cattle responded to his calls and gestures, moving steadily despite the ominous clouds above. The wind began to pick up, and the first drops of rain fell, lightly at first, but the pressure in the air suggested that the storm would intensify rapidly. By late morning, the storm had fully arrived. Sheets of rain pounded the land, turning the fields into a mix of mud and rushing water. Lightning split the sky above, and thunder rolled in heavy waves, echoing across the ranch. John could barely see through the rain, but he refused to stop. Every fence, every gate, every animal had to be protected. He worked tirelessly, moving supplies, reinforcing barriers, and keeping the cattle calm, his body soaked, muscles trembling, and energy running dangerously low. The rain intensified, washing away some of the soil he had worked so hard to reinforce. A section of the hillside near the creek began to show signs of slipping again. John knew he had to act immediately. He grabbed ropes, heavy rocks, and wooden posts, building temporary supports to hold the soil in place. His hands were blistered, his arms screamed with fatigue, and the rain soaked him to the bone. But he continued, driven by a determination stronger than exhaustion. One wrong move, one delay, and the damage could be catastrophic. Hours passed in a blur of mud, rain, and unrelenting effort. Thunder, the horse, moved faithfully at John's side, responding to his commands and helping him navigate the treacherous terrain. The cattle remained calm under his guidance, though their ears flicked nervously at the sound of rolling thunder and splashing water. John knew that their safety relied not only on physical barriers, but also on his presence and reassurance. Every shout, every gesture, every steady word mattered. By mid-afternoon, the rain showed no signs of easing. The soil was slippery and treacherous, and John's strength was nearing its limit. His movements were slower now, deliberate and careful, but no less determined. He paused briefly to catch his breath, leaning against a sturdy post, water streaming down his face and mixing with the dirt. His vision was blurred from fatigue, and his muscles threatened to give out. Yet he refused to allow despair to settle in. He had faced fire, storms, and landslides, and he would not allow this storm to defeat him. As he continued, John noticed that the water in the lower fields was rising faster than he had anticipated. The temporary barriers he had built were holding, just barely, but the risk of flooding remained. He redoubled his efforts, moving rocks, reinforcing soil, and guiding water away from vulnerable areas. Every action required careful calculation, and every moment brought new challenges. One slip, one misstep, and the results could be devastating. By late afternoon, the storm finally began to ease, the rain tapering off to a light drizzle. The dark clouds slowly dispersed, revealing glimpses of sunlight breaking through the gray sky. John, drenched, exhausted, and trembling from fatigue, surveyed the ranch. The fields were muddy but intact, the cattle safe in their designated areas, and the hillside stabilized enough to prevent further landslides. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the adrenaline and tension finally begin to release. The damage was evident. Yes, flattened grass, displaced soil, and weakened fences, but the ranch had survived. John felt a profound sense of relief mixed with pride. The work had been grueling, the challenges relentless, but he had endured. More importantly, he had protected the land and the animals he had spent his life caring for. Every ache, every blister, every moment of exhaustion had been worth it. As evening approached, John guided the cattle back toward the barns, ensuring that each one had access to food, water, and shelter. He moved with deliberate care, every step slow and steady despite his trembling muscles. By the time the animals were secure, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the fields. The rain-soaked landscape shimmered in the light, the streams sparkling, and the air smelled fresh and alive. John finally returned to the farmhouse, his body completely spent. He washed off the mud and sweat, feeling the stiffness and soreness in every joint. Dinner was a quiet, simple meal, but it nourished him and gave him the strength to reflect on the past days. He sat by the window, staring out at the ranch, thinking of the challenges he had faced: fire, storm, landslide, and flooding. Each obstacle had tested his strength, endurance, and resolve, and each time he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the land he loved. Before heading to bed, John made one final walk around the property, checking fences, gates, and water supplies. The cattle were calm, the fields intact, and the hillside secure. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of calm. The ranch was safe, the animals were protected, and he had survived yet another series of trials. He paused, looking at the stars beginning to appear above, and felt a deep gratitude, not for the ease of life, but for the strength, resilience, and courage that had carried him through hardship. Finally, John climbed into bed, every muscle aching, every joint sore, and every limb exhausted. Yet there was a satisfaction in the pain, a quiet joy in knowing that he had faced each challenge with determination and skill. The ranch had survived, and he had fulfilled his responsibility to protect it. As he drifted into a deep, well-earned sleep, he knew that the land, the animals, and his life were all intertwined in a way that required constant vigilance, unwavering dedication, and endless courage. John would face more challenges in the future, there was no doubt about that. But he also knew that he had proven to himself and to the land that he had the strength to endure, the wisdom to act, and the perseverance to overcome whatever came his way. The ranch was more than just a place to live. It was a life built from sweat, care, and courage, and he was proud to call it his own.